The purpose of this video is to explore some of the materials that you have in your art kit, and also to give you some information about some basic elements like line and form that I'm going to want you to have for your Zentangle assignment that's going to be coming up, but also just generally things to know as you're learning to draw and paint and make art. So starting with line, you can start by just exploring some of the different kinds of materials you've got. So everything from basic graphite pencils, you can explore some of the different values that you have. So your HB, which would be kind of like your normal number 2 pencil, kind of light, up to some of your darker pencils, like your 2B, 4B, ebony. So as you're exploring these, I also want you to play with the line thickness. So that's a big thing in line drawing. You can use just simple lines to say a lot about form. You can even use lines to create different values. But using a variety of lines, so thick and thin and lighter and darker, and then even changing the thickness or thinness within one mark. That can be really important. So I got out here, this is my graphite stick, so again you can kind of explore the different types of lines from thin to thick that you can make with that. You could even shade in an area and use an eraser to try drawing some different lines just with your eraser. Using some of your different materials, exploring them, continuing with that. We have some different types of charcoal. So this is the darker charcoal, or it's also might be called a black chalk pastel. So you can use that and draw some lines in that. So I've got a bunch of different of these pencil top erasers. First of all, notice I'm not actually using them on top of my pencil. The reason I have these for you is so that you can get more detail when you're erasing. So whether that's, just erasing like a tiny little bit of something, or it's actually drawing with it. And then you might have a bunch of them in your kit, because you might be using some of them with some of these messier, dirtier materials. So if you're doing a line drawing, or I'm sorry, if you're doing a graphite drawing, just in regular graphite pencil, you would not want to use this eraser that you've just gotten charcoal all over. All right, so some different materials that we can use. Some of your different markers. So just these thick Crayola washable markers. You can actually get a variety of types of marks or lines, whether you're using the tip or the side, or kind of going from one to the other or pressing harder, so try that out. We've got some different charcoal pencils, you can try those out. We've got even a white charcoal pencil, which I can actually make a mark over this. I wasn't really sure how well that would work, but it did. I could also use that. Maybe I'll do this over here just to create a little more room. Could do that on a different color piece of paper. Don't want you to forget actually making line with a brush and your watercolor. So if you don't already have some water out and a paper towel, you always want to have your paper towel out when you're working with watercolor, because this will help you control the watercolor and kind of erase even if you get too much pigment on the page. So get that out, stop the video and get that out if you need to stop the video. All right, so I might need to add a little bit of water to this first, kind of activate it. If you don't add enough water to this, you'll get a really light pigment. So when you're starting to watercolor paint, you might start by just adding water to each of these. Right now though, we're just gonna be using this a little bit. So, but just make sure you have that plenty wet and get plenty of water on your brush, and see how you can really easily change the quality of the line with that. And then of course you can try out some different brushes. All right, if there are any materials that I missed, say that and then I remembered, yes, we've got oil pastel. Oil pastel is not always the best material to do a line drawing with because it will give you kind of this like textured line, and a lot of times you may want kind of a more precise line, but you can try that out. And colored pencil, how could I forget colored pencil? So again, see if you can vary your line quality as you work with that. Then definitely want to remember these. Some of these different pens are what we'll be using when we're doing our Zentangle. So you may not be able to as easily change the line quality using a ballpoint pen. So that's what I'm using right now. So I might have to work a little harder, go back and forth, press on it, and really consciously make the effort to change the line quality with that. These are resistant to water, by the way, so whereas our Crayola washable markers, if you add a little bit of water to them, it kind of gives you like a watercolor effect, which could be really cool. But of course, if you don't want that to happen, then you would want to avoid that. So if you are doing, say, a pen and ink drawing, and you want to later add watercolor, some of these markers and pens that do not interact with water would be better for that. So now I'm using a permanent Sharpie. It's an ultrafine Sharpie. I might sometimes call this a pen, even though you might think of it more as a marker. I think of this ultrafine type more as a pen because it makes marks like a pen. And then you've got your thicker Sharpie, your permanent Sharpie, and that of course will give you a thicker line quality. You might be able to vary it a little bit though. Again, these are all not reactive to water, so those really aren't going to bleed or change when I put water on them. You also do have, though, in your art kit, it might be a Sharpie pen or a felt tip marker or pen like this. These are both actually different types of felt tips. So if you are, usually when people say Sharpie, they're thinking of the original Sharpie, which is actually a permanent marker. These, I wouldn't just, if I'm asking you to get out this, I'm not going to just say, oh, your Sharpie. This is going to be your felt tip pen or maybe your Sharpie pen. But if you are buying your own supplies, be aware that just because it says Sharpie doesn't mean it's actually a permanent marker like these over here. So these that I just used, my Sharpie pen has a really fine tip to it. That's that one. Or my felt tip pen here. They're both felt tips, but this is just not quite as fine a point. But when I add water to these start to blur and create that kind of effect. So again, don't use those if you're going to go over it with watercolor and want to have some more permanent lines. All right, so I think that's what I wanted to say about line. One thing I'll add to this, I've given you guys or asked you to get this year toothpicks. So I'm going to get back out my oil pastel and I'm going to color a little bit more, so don't be afraid to get a really nice value on that. Like press hard with that, and then I can actually draw a line by scratching out with my toothpick. Or if I'm using a light color, you may barely be able to see that in the video because it's kind of far away in light, but I could also go over this with a darker color. So you may have done this kind of thing when you were little with crayons or with oil pastels, and then I can scratch into that and you can get a line. So I just made that a little thicker since it was hard to see in the video since it was so thin. All right, there we go. Lots of things about line, and again, varying the line. When you're doing a simple line drawing, always vary the line. Thicker to thinner mainly, but also darker and lighter. Okay, the other thing I really wanted to talk about in this video is form. So how do you take a shape? So we'll start with the shape, so you guys all kind of know your basic geometric shapes. And then we also have organic shapes. And then you can even have a shape that maybe you do just with value, with kind of a soft edge like this, rather than starting it with a line. To me, all of those are shapes. You could debate whether this is a shape, but to me, I would call that a shape with a soft edge. But to make a shape into a form, one of the basic ways to do that is with line. So you may have learned this maybe back in the day when you were very young. Try to move that around a little bit. Okay. You may have learned how to make a form, a basic cube. So one way, I think a really good way to do this is to start with a square like so, and then you can draw another square, and you can make this one appear a little bit farther back by putting it up and to the side. So this is going to be the front and the back plane of your box or cube. And then I'm just connecting these. And I'm trying to make it so that all of these lines, the lines of this front plane and back plane, are parallel to one another. So all of the horizontals are all parallel. All of these verticals are parallel to one another. And then also these diagonal lines should be pretty much parallel to one another. So right now we've got that as like a glass cube or plexiglass. If you want that to look like it's a solid cube, then I'm just going to erase those lines that would be hidden and to help really finish that look. I might go over it with a darker pen or marker, something like that. All right, this is a way of drawing that's called parallel projection. Okay, so later on we're going to be learning about using one-point perspective, which is a little bit different, but this parallel projection is just the simplest way to do a simple form like a cube. This is more of a one-point perspective style. You could also turn your cube so that you're looking at the corner. So you can do parallel projection that way as well. Or sometimes you might see this as isometric drawing or isometric projection. So we're going to start with the corner because that's going to be what's dead in front of us. And then we'll make our diagonal lines still parallel to one another. And then we'll have another vertical line, and again, those should be parallel. And then we can follow that up on this side with another plane where these lines are parallel. And then this and this will be parallel, and this will be parallel to each other. So that's what we're going for. So different types of parallel projection, or again, you might call that isometric. If that is isometric, just has to do with these degrees here. I think technically to be isometric, it's like 120 degrees and 30 degrees, if I'm remembering correctly. Okay, and then if another way to think about this, if this was a little confusing, you could just start with this one plane, and we're just kind of angling it back because this is this corner is turned to us, and then we can draw that again back here. So kind of like we did with that, and then just connect the dots. And then again, you could get rid of those lines back there. So this time I'm gonna, as I go over those, I'm going to use one of my pens. So this is my felt tip pen or felt tip marker. All right, so we are going to be using these different kinds of black pens and markers, these finer point ones, when we're doing our Zentangles. So I'm going to practice with that a little bit. So I could shade a little bit on one of these sides. I talked about how you can actually shade using line. So this type of shading where you're shading using line is called hatching. And then when you make it cross like this, it's just a different type of hatching, and you would call that cross hatching. All right. So a few more basic forms you could do, 3D forms. You could take your circle and turn that into something that looks more like a sphere. You could do that by shading it. You could use hatching. Might be a little bit harder to do with the curves, but you could do it. You could also, though, and I could draw, say, maybe a shadow underneath it. So that would help it look 3D. And then I could also use more shading on this. Another type of shading I can do with marks is stippling. So when I'm using those little dots, I'm using stippling. And over here, when I was doing the lines, that was hatching too. They were just curved hatch marks because it's a curved surface. You could also, with any of these, you can shade them with your pencil. So we're going to be doing most of our drawing in pen with the Zentangle, but you may want to do some of the shading in pencil. So with pencil, you may find it a little bit easier to get kind of a smooth shadow. So you can just do it by changing the pressure. You could do it by going over some of this a little bit more and then not going over this as much. And I want you to really practice, how much can you do without even using something to blend it. But then, of course, you can then use a finger or a paper towel. And I do love to have you guys use the paper towels. So I'm just folding this to make my own fancy blending tool, which you could buy. They're called a tortillon, and you could spend a lot of money, or you could just fold it. So I was just folding it into like a rectangle, and then once it's pretty thick, then I can just fold it into basically a triangle. And you can make these smaller if you want them to be more delicate. Just start out with a really small paper towel. All right, and then that'll be nice and stiff, but also have a really little point. Okay, so I didn't roll it, I folded it. So that's how you make your own tortillon without spending a lot of money. So that's what we're going to use in class, since it would be pretty expensive to have tortillons for everybody that we constantly had to keep throwing out and replacing. All right, so I've got my smooth thing. Notice how much that really spread. So you kind of have to watch out with that you can easily get rid of all your white. And to make it look 3D, you kind of have to leave some white. So if you need to, you can erase back. And I'm actually kind of stippling to erase to get that a little bit smoother. And more gradual. So I'm just making little like dots with that. And then if it's, if it's not smooth enough, you could always go back. I actually just sort of instinctively started refolding this, because if I'm trying to make this lighter, I don't necessarily want to use the part that's already dark, because that would make it dark again. So I'd want to use a brand new spot. So you see why your tortillons may not last long, so you may not want to spend a lot of money on them. Anyway, so let's see. I think that is everything I wanted to talk about with different types of forms. I say that, and I'll add a few more. You can do a few other basic forms. So to make a cylinder, the top plane of your cylinder, the part that would be, say, this plane, instead of being a circle, when you see it in perspective, it's going to be an ellipse. It's a lot like an oval. There's a little more to it that we'll learn later. And then you would basically have another one of these on the bottom. So again, just kind of line them up, and then you have your parallel lines. So there that is. We wouldn't see that whole bottom plane though, unless it's not, at least when it's sitting on a table. So again, I would just get rid of this. So you could skip that line in there if you want to, and then make sure that this curve and this curve are going to be basically the same. So again, basically parallel to each other. And then sort of a variation on that, you've got a cone. So if I started with my ellipse at the bottom, then I'm just going to basically add a triangle to it. And then if I was looking at the bottom, if I was looking at this from underneath, I would actually see that. But if it's sitting on a table, so here instead, it's sitting on a table, so I would get rid of that back plane. There it is sitting on a table, it's casting a little shadow, and again I could add a little bit of shading to it to make it look even more 3D. Same with this. I could add a little bit of shading. So here I'm using hatching, and the key with hatching, I always would encourage you to have it kind of mirror what's happening with the edges. So up and down, vertical lines, and then these curving lines. That'll make that look really good. So in here I did start out with these ones that were sort of fighting the edge. So I actually would discourage fighting the edge and encourage you to kind of go with these edges, like in here or in here, where the diagonals mimic what's happening on the edge. All right, so to sum up, we've got our line, our variety of line or line variation going from thick to thin, even within the same line. We covered different types of shapes, geometric, organic, ones with soft edges. We covered different types of forms, and in covering different types of forms, we also talked a lot about value. So we did some hatching, some cross hatching, some stippling, which is just these little dots. You can make them closer together for a darker value or farther apart for a lighter value. And then, of course, a gradation. So I would encourage you to practice your gradation like I did in here. So you could just draw yourself a little V like that and just practice drawing with really small little marks and just pressing harder and then lighter to practice that smooth gradation without even having to use a blending tool or your finger. All right, so there you have it. Happy drawing!